If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push, they float. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a curtain shifts, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe. Only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that just say, still here. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. She never wanted the crown, not truly, and he, her brother, wasn't meant to want it either. But power in Egypt didn't always wait for hunger. Sometimes, it chose the nearest name, even if that name trembled, even if it split in two. You arrive in Alexandria at the hour when oil lamps burn low, and the stone walls don't echo anymore. Somewhere beyond the open shutters, the Nile breathes in slow rhythm, not a river, but a sleeping lung. And in a room meant for rulers, two children are being dressed in gold. Not out of celebration, but necessity. You see Cleopatra, still barely more than a girl, slipping her arms through linen stiffened with ceremonial dye. Her fingers do not shake, but that's only because she's already learned stillness is safer than defiance. The women attending her speak softly in Coptic and Greek voices meant to feel warm but never linger. None of them meet her eyes for long. And in the next chamber, behind another veil, her brother Ptolemy XIII is being prepared as well. He is younger, slightly smaller, and less certain, but certainty was never a requirement for kingship. His role was chosen for him. Her role was agreed upon in private, by men whose names would never be remembered outside papyrus scraps. Together, they were to reign, in theory. But the theory was never whispered aloud. Only the names, Cleopatra and Ptolemy, queen and king, sister and brother, two pieces placed side by side on a board where someone else rolled the dice. The throne wasn't carved for two. It was built for stillness. One voice, one face, one lineage made visible. Sharing it was like offering two shadows to a single flame. One would always consume the other. And yet, there they sat. In the ceremonial courtyard, guests lined the marble walls, their faces flickering in torchlight, like coins catching different sides of the fire. Some leaned in with genuine awe, others with thin smiles too tightly pulled. Cleopatra held her chin high, not out of arrogance, but because she knew how many watched for the blink that meant fear. Her brother said nothing. His lips moved once, a practiced greeting, then silence. Even the priests spoke only when necessary. The coronation was more gesture than joy. It felt not like a beginning, but like a decision being slowly buried under silk. She would remember the weight of her earrings, the way her sandals pressed into the mosaic, the way her brother's hand never once reached for hers. He did not hate her, not then. Perhaps he never truly did, but he had been told, quietly and repeatedly, that she would one day step beyond him, that she was not content to be beside him, that one day he would look to speak, and she would already be speaking. Whether that was true didn't matter. The thought took root like dust in a closed room. Their father, Ptolemy XII, Auletes, had left behind a divided legacy, debts to Rome, shifting loyalties, and children too young to remember the moment the world shifted. His last will, or at least the version Rome claimed to possess, named Cleopatra and her brother as joint rulers. But wills were just suggestions when they passed through Roman hands. You picture them now, that night after the ceremony, in opposite wings of the palace. The stone corridors are vast and cold, Even in Alexandria's heat, Cleopatra sits alone, her feet tucked beneath her, unbraiding the crown's heaviness from her hair. She does not cry. Instead, she hums softly, faintly the way her mother once did when lighting a lamp. A song with no lyrics, just breath and memory. Across the palace, Ptolemy sleeps fitfully beneath linens too fine for comfort. He clutches a small golden token meant to signify authority. But the metal is warm from his hand, not from anyone else's praise. Their reign had begun, but only in name. What lived beneath the crown was not unity, nor even cooperation. It was delay, a long, slow quiet before the room filled with whispers. And this shared beginning was never quite shared. It was just a fact someone recorded. The kind scribes would press into wet clay or scratch onto papyrus, with ink made from soot and honey, words that would someday be read by hands centuries removed, unaware that the ink had been diluted by silence. Some nights don't begin, they just forget how to stop being days. And that was how their rule began, not with horns or banners or proclamations shouted from balconies, but with two pairs of eyes refusing to meet, and a city already choosing sides beneath its breath. Even the coins would have to decide which face to carry. Was this peace? Or just the moment before history remembers it wasn't? From the outside, the royal palace in Alexandria looked still serene in the way stone appears calm until it's cracked. Marble columns stood unbothered by time. Curtains billowed faintly in the sea wind. But inside, the quiet had already started to press inward, folding around walls like fog made of fabric. There was no shouting in the early days of their reign. No slammed doors, no broken vessels, just long glances, strange hesitations, and too many silences that weren't empty, only paused. This was not a place where anger came openly. Power in the Ptolemaic court, especially between siblings, didn't fester like fire. It grew cold and elaborate, wrapped in courtesies, cloaked in smiles that held no warmth. And the deeper you moved into the palace, the more you began to feel watched, not by eyes, exactly, but by the rooms themselves. The hallways were narrow, where they shouldn't have been, deliberately twisting in strange, thoughtful ways. The floor mosaics, dazzling and ancient, seemed designed to make you look down more often than ahead. Guards were placed not just for protection, but observation. Even the carved birds on the balustrades faced inward, their stone beaks tilted toward the atrium as if mid-listen. This was the world Cleopatra and her brother inherited. And though it glittered with gold and alabaster, it was not soft. It was dim, faint, hollow in the way a stage might be when the players forget who the audience really is. At first, they tried. There were formal appearances, shared decisions, feasts where they sat beside each other on a double throne no one believed could last. She would nod when he spoke, even if his voice was too soft to carry. He would listen when she read aloud dispatches from provincial governors, his fingers tightening slightly on the armrest when her Greek outpaced his. They smiled at one another when required, but it was the kind of smile children wear when asked to make peace by adults who have no idea what's really been said. Even within the same palace, they were being raised into different futures. Ptolemy III was surrounded by tutors and advisors who reminded him, often and gently, that a woman's voice was not fit for command, that his sister, older though she was, would one day need to marry, and when she did, she would no longer be sovereign. Cleopatra, meanwhile, studied languages no one expected her to use. She pored over Egyptian religious texts, while others treated them as ceremonial formalities. She learned to navigate Roman customs, Hellenistic philosophy, native Egyptian iconography, not because someone required it, but because she understood something her brother didn't. This throne would not hold both of them, not for long. The question wasn't if the crown would tilt, it was which way. They didn't argue, not openly. Instead, their conflict filled the corridors like a scent, too subtle to name, but unmistakable once it clung to your clothes. Cleopatra began appearing at court functions without him. When foreign envoys arrived, they found her waiting alone, poised, already informed of their concerns. Her brother, when he did attend, sat quieter each time, surrounded by men who whispered just loud enough to be overheard. Even the servants began to choose sides in ways so small they could have been accidents. One tray delivered to her rooms colder than usual, one scroll misplaced for a day, a robe refolded wrong. These were not attacks. They were tiny absences of care, made to seem like chance. And the curtains always. Those curtains swayed when no breeze came. They were pulled back a little too slowly, left ajar in a way that made you feel like someone had just stopped listening. You never knew which room might have someone waiting behind the fabric. The palace, once grand, had become a theater, and the actors were playing roles none of them chose. One evening, Cleopatra walked the length of the eastern corridor barefoot, not because she was careless, but because the silence felt too loud, and she wanted to hear the sound of her own steps. The stones were cool. One by one, they whispered her weight back to her. She paused by the doorway of the great archive, the room that held the family records, dynastic scrolls, treaties bound in wax, and whispers preserved in ink. She didn't enter, just stood there for a moment, as if waiting to be seen. But there was no one, only the slow rustle of papyrus, shifting on the breeze of her breath. Some nights don't need betrayal. They just collect it quietly, like dust. Her brother, in another wing, played a game with his tutors that evening, a strategy exercise involving tiny carved soldiers on a wooden board. He moved his pieces thoughtfully, then too quickly, then not at all. He lost, and when the tutor tried to explain the logic behind his defeat, he said nothing, just looked toward the window, where the curtains moved as if someone had just stepped through. There are moments when trust doesn't vanish, it just leaves the room, and no one asks where it went. That was what happened between Cleopatra and Ptolemy in those first shared months. Nothing sudden, no open fracture, just a slow, soft shifting, a mutual realization, spoken only in stillness, that their kingdom was not big enough for both of them, not in the way each imagined power. Cleopatra began to write letters, not declarations, not edicts, not yet. Letters to priests in Thebes, notes to Roman officials her father once entertained, inquiries masked as pleasantries, each written in a different hand, each copied with deliberate elegance, each folded so that the seals would close like a quiet breath. Her brother, perhaps sensing the movement, began inviting his own circle into rooms that were once neutral, advisors who knew Rome better than Egypt, scholars who spoke Latin more often than Greek. It wasn't planning, not outright, but it was placement, a rebalancing of the palace's breath. And the curtains, they kept watching, somewhere near the entrance, where a basin held rose water for ritual cleansing. Someone etched a name that would be erased the next morning. Not a threat, not a cry, just a name hers written in reverse. Because even the walls had started choosing. History rarely records discomfort. It prefers events, proclamations, victories, and disasters. But if someone had unrolled the scroll naming Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as joint sovereigns, they might have noticed the discomfort hiding between the lines, not in the ink itself, but in the breath it carried. Two names, joined as if by ceremony, sat on parchment that cracked when bent. One name edged slightly higher than the other, as if even the writing hand couldn't pretend they were equal. Their co-rule was not a vision, but a compromise born of necessity, framed as tradition. Egypt had endured chaos before. Rome's shadow had begun to stretch not just across seas, but into ledgers, alliances, and inheritance. The idea of two siblings sharing the throne had precedent in dynastic law. Yet the moment this decree passed from papyrus to palace, its truth began to bend. The scroll was read aloud in the temple of Isis, beneath columns still darkened by incense. The priests did not smile. They chanted the names as required, added the ritual flourishes, and placed the document in a sealed alcove. That was the last time it was treated with reverence. What followed was a performance, one of those soft, prolonged fractures that empires specialize in staging. There would be no coup, not yet, but the division had already started, as gently and predictably as the Nile's yearly retreat. The court chamber was where it first became visible. In this space, carved from marble veined with gold, the throne had been altered, split down the middle and widened to fit two, an official gesture, a political design. But Cleopatra rarely sat back. She leaned forward when discussing grain allocations, spoke plainly about Alexandria's debts, and quietly adjusted advisors' suggestions as if she were merely clarifying, not overruling. Ptolemy did not object, not in words. He often agreed, occasionally nodded, but with each gesture of silence, he ceded something intangible: dignity, presence, the shape of how people looked at him. His advisors, men older, sharp with Roman etiquette and local suspicion, began addressing Cleopatra's conclusions with a slight pause, waiting to see if the boy beside her would echo them. More often than not, he didn't. It wasn't defiance, it was omission, absence as signal. She noticed, of course, every missing phrase, every hesitation, but she said nothing. Not because she feared him, but because she feared the stillness. Stillness in a kingdom like theirs wasn't safety. It was the space in which others plotted. Stillness let the scroll with their names be forgotten. It let the audience hall shift in shape, not by rebuilding stone, but by the direction of a glance or the weight of a whisper. There is a certain kind of erosion that comes not from storms, but from the soft repetition of silence. It crept into everything. Meetings became quieter. Messengers delivered notes to her rooms first, even when addressed to both. Temple petitions, which were supposed to be reviewed jointly, arrived with her wax seal already opened. Servants began greeting her with the ceremonial hand-to-heart reserved for monarchs, while offering him only the abbreviated gesture used for noble sons. This was not victory, only imbalance. The household staff tried to maintain balance, but they were no longer sure what that meant. When wine was poured at meals, hers arrived first. When visitors came from Rome, they asked to speak with Her Majesty before remembering there were two rulers, and one of them was still learning to read Latin. He began skipping audiences, sometimes out of quiet protest, sometimes because his advisors told him to. Let her speak, they said. It will be useful to know how far she intends to go. But Ptolemy didn't need to be told she was moving further away. He felt it each time her name was spoken without his. One afternoon, the Alexandrian Council convened to debate the handling of tax disputes in the Delta. The chamber was full. Cleopatra arrived on time, took her seat, and waited. Her brother never appeared. The conversation began without him. His chair sat hollow, soft linen cushions, uncreased. Later, when asked, he said only that he hadn't been informed. But they both knew that wasn't true. His signature was already on the invitation. That evening, as the sun bled slowly across the harbor, Cleopatra stood at one of the upper balconies, watching ships return. She didn't speak. Behind her, the palace murmured with late-day motions, sandals against stone, olive oil lamps being lit, doves returning to their carved perches. Somewhere far below, a scribe copied the decree onto another scroll, to be sent to the archives in Thebes. The scroll still bore both names, Cleopatra, Ptolemy, but ink does not weigh the same on both sides of a page, and everyone had begun to read the names in a different order. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. Even the scribes had started adjusting how they described the crown. Under Her Majesty's guidance appeared more frequently than by joint command. These were small things, easy to overlook, but Cleopatra noticed them all. She never corrected the scribes, nor did she publicly emphasize the difference. Her power, like the silence around her, grew slowly, not by seizing, but by remaining. That's the part history sometimes misses. Not every throne is taken. Some are simply never let go. Ptolemy, though younger, understood just enough to resent what hadn't been named. His advisors whispered of restraint, caution, of Rome's favor. They reminded him of Pompey, of Caesar, of the senators who watched from across the sea. Rome, they said, would prefer a man on the throne. But what Rome preferred didn't always matter, not in the hall where Cleopatra now stood unchallenged. Sometimes he dreamed of breaking the scroll, unrolling it and tearing it in two. But the scroll wasn't the source. It was only a symbol of what had already passed. And outside, the river continued, soft, still, slow. What lived between Cleopatra and her brother during those early years could not rightly be called rivalry. Rivalry assumes heat, passion, directness. Their estrangement was colder than that, something slow and quiet that grew not through confrontation, but through absence, omission, and the way stillness can sometimes say more than a scream. The palace didn't echo with arguments. No servants whispered of shouting matches. There were no public insults, no shattered amphorae, just long walks taken in different directions, decisions signed without consultation, and questions answered with carefully measured silence. The colder it became, the more refined their gestures grew. Cleopatra stopped using certain hallways, not because they were blocked, but because she had learned her brother preferred them. When they crossed paths, which was less and less frequent, they greeted each other with gestures that mimicked familiarity but held no warmth. Their smiles were too rehearsed, their eyes too fixed on the floor between them. To those unfamiliar with the subtle games of court, it may have appeared peaceful. To those who lived within those walls, it was unmistakably the beginning of a fracture not visible, but deeply felt. Even the rooms seemed to adapt. Where once the court had gathered under vaulted ceilings to hear both rulers speak side by side, now ministers began dividing their briefings. Cleopatra's council would meet early in the morning, her brother's in the afternoon. This change was never announced, yet everyone adjusted, as if it had always been so. One day, the seat beside her at the table remained empty throughout the entire discussion, and no one mentioned it. Another day, when he spoke to the army's commanders, her name was omitted entirely from the speech. When asked, he claimed it had been an oversight, but no one believed that. There was a chill in every exchange now, a kind of ambient tension that never rose high enough to be called dangerous, but never dipped low enough to feel safe. It was something like walking through a room where a fire had recently gone out, the walls still holding the memory of warmth, but the air offering none. The city noticed, but pretended not to. In Alexandria, a city that had seen dynasties unravel, silence was its own kind of survival. The scholars and merchants, the priests and guards all understood the value of looking the other way when royalty began to rot from the inside. There were festivals, of course, held with the same color and music, but the crowds could sense the absence. When both rulers appeared on the royal barge for a ceremonial voyage along the Nile, observers noted how Cleopatra stood facing forward, her eyes fixed on the horizon, while Ptolemy lingered near the back, his posture slouched, his gaze wandering somewhere just beyond the edge of the crowd. During this period, Cleopatra deepened her involvement in state matters not with flair, but with relentless constancy. She met with priests from Upper Egypt, wrote directly to Roman envoys, oversaw engineering repairs to Alexandria's irrigation systems, and even visited the grain silos unannounced. Each action was small, but together they formed a picture of presence, of someone who did not wait for power but carried it. Her brother, by contrast, became increasingly surrounded by voices not his own. Advisors filled the void around him, men who spoke of duty but acted with agenda. They fed him phrases, reminded him of his entitlement, cautioned him against letting his sister become the face of Egypt. They did not tell him to act not yet, but they planted the seed that something was slipping away. And once that thought took root, even silence started to feel like a threat. At times, Cleopatra likely wondered what her father would have thought, the same father who had once fled Egypt in disgrace, only to return with Roman backing and a debt to pay. He had been shrewd, manipulative, desperate, and not particularly beloved. But he had understood something vital about survival. Appearances matter less than leverage, and loyalty cannot be inherited, only managed. Cleopatra, inheriting that truth, was already thinking further ahead than the palace walls. She studied not just Egyptian law, but Roman politics. She memorized the names of senators, knew which generals had sons, which tax officials preferred Greek to Latin. Her brother, meanwhile, remained fixed in place, physically present, politically stagnant, emotionally adrift. What made this division so dangerous was not its visibility, but its subtlety. A kingdom can endure open conflict. It rarely survives quiet disintegration. By the time Rome began to truly watch, and Rome was always watching, the split was no longer a question of when. It was simply a matter of how deep the divide had grown. In private, Cleopatra began to speak differently, not openly, not recklessly, but with a kind of careful melancholy that suggested she knew her brother was no longer beside her, only near. When her handmaid asked why she had not invited him to the midsummer procession, Cleopatra replied, "He no longer waits for invitations, and I no longer write them." And still, there was no war, no blood spilled, no throne overtaken, just days that grew longer between their meetings, just choices made without consultation, just a coldness in the halls that even the midday sun could not dissolve. When Cleopatra passed a room where Ptolemy once studied as a child, she paused. The scrolls had been moved, the cushions replaced. His favorite ivory game board was gone. In its place sat an open map of the empire, partially unrolled, its corners weighted by small stones. She didn't touch it, only stood there, watching the parchment breathe in the warm breeze, as if the map itself were unsure who it belonged to now. "You've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here." Later that evening, as the lanterns were lit along the reflecting pool, a servant remarked that no doves had landed near the water that day, not a single one. The air, it seemed, had become too still for wings. Perhaps that was the most telling sign of all. It wasn't just that Cleopatra had begun to move alone through the palace. It was that people had started moving around her differently. The arrangement of guards, once ceremonial, had become careful. Servants who once passed by without hesitation now slowed their pace when near her, uncertain whether silence was respect or surveillance. The scent of decision lingered in her footsteps, and that, more than any title, was what disturbed the old patterns of the court. There was a moment, not long after the spring floods had receded from the Nile, when Cleopatra walked through the Hall of Offerings en route to a morning council. The hall, flanked by lotus-carved columns and gilded doorways, was normally a quiet thoroughfare, not deserted, but serene. On this day, however, she found two guards posted not at the main arch but further back, standing directly in her path, not blocking it, but adjusting the shape of her journey in a way that forced acknowledgement. She paused for a second, not visibly, but enough that one of the chamberlain's assistants noticed and stilled his breath. The guards stepped aside with perfect deference. They bowed. They did not speak. But something had shifted. The route she always took was no longer assumed. Someone, somewhere, had changed the pattern. No explanation had been offered, and none would be. That was the way it worked when decisions were made in rooms you weren't invited into. These weren't assassins, of course, and Cleopatra knew that. They were guards, loyal to the crown, to both crowns, as the phrasing still insisted. But the way they moved now, the way they waited for her eyes before reacting, the way they positioned their bodies just a little too straight. It spoke not of loyalty, but of hesitation. She continued walking, her sandals whispering across the polished stone, the echo of her movement too soft to challenge the silence behind her. But the moment stayed with her. And later that evening, when she returned to her private quarters, she found a tray of pomegranate seeds left untouched by the maid assigned to her chambers. The fruit was fresh, chilled, and precisely cut, a sign of respect, or at least attentiveness. But Cleopatra did not eat, not because she feared poison, not exactly, but because something in her had begun to mistrust even the offerings meant to please. What unnerved her wasn't a threat. It was the sense that even the palace no longer assumed she was safe by default. That to exist within those walls now required her to see from every angle, to question every habit, to walk not with confidence, but with calculation. She began memorizing the guards' rotations, the staff schedules, the patterns of light across the courtyard, not out of paranoia, but because power, when questioned, does not always shout. Sometimes it repositions the chairs in your favorite room and waits to see if you'll notice. And she did. Across the palace, her brother sat in the colonnade courtyard, reading aloud with one of his tutors. The text was a Roman tract, translated awkwardly into Greek, its margins covered with corrections and ink smudges. He read poorly, the words landing heavily, uncertain in cadence. His tutor did not interrupt, only offered the occasional nod, as if each misstep might eventually balance itself. Around them, the fountain burbled faintly. A bird dipped into the water, shook its feathers, and flew off without glancing back. Ptolemy did not speak of Cleopatra, not to his tutor, not to his guards. When asked how the morning council had gone, he responded only that he hadn't attended because the topic did not require his attention. The way he said it too easily, too quickly betrayed that it did. The reality was that he had not been invited. Not officially, at least. His name had been omitted from the list of attendees. A clerical error, someone would later claim. But there had been too many of those lately to believe in coincidence. There's a tension that emerges when two names are placed on one throne, and only one begins to fill the space between them. At first, it is awkwardness. Then, it becomes discomfort. Finally, it curdles into something harder to reverse, a structure of feeling in which every act, no matter how small, is interpreted as intent. A misplaced message becomes a rebuke. A missed greeting becomes a signal. And when Cleopatra began carrying her own copies of key documents into meetings, when she started sending letters without requiring the co-signature of her brother, the palace felt it. She wasn't announcing anything, she was simply walking forward. But forward, in a space meant to hold balance, was a provocation all its own. What had once been an arrangement between siblings had become a quiet contest of motion. She advanced. He remained still. She spoke. He delayed. She acted. He watched. This wasn't because she craved dominance, not in the way history often paints ambition. Rather, she recognized that motion, once begun, was not easily reversed, and she had already stepped into the rhythm of the Nile, the court, the letters from Rome. He had not. When her council expanded to include advisors from Upper Egypt, men more loyal to religious reform than Ptolemaic orthodoxy, her brother's chamberlain objected. But the objection came as a whisper, passed through 3 mouths before it reached hers. She listened, thanked the messenger, and continued on as if nothing had been said. Later that week, she ordered that the council room be repainted with frescoes depicting the goddess Ma'at, balance, order, truth. The imagery was symbolic, the message unmistakable. Her brother's image did not appear in the mural, nor was it mentioned during the dedication. Not long after, the guards in the Hall of Offerings were replaced again, this time with soldiers loyal not to either sibling, but directly to the treasury. Neutral, some claimed. But Cleopatra understood neutrality was often just hesitation wearing a softer mask. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. By midsummer, the palace corridors had grown strangely quiet. Not because there were fewer people, but because footsteps had changed. They no longer rang with the randomness of daily life. They measured themselves, waited for one another, paused at corners. Even laughter, when it occurred, seemed too brief to trust. It wasn't war. It wasn't even strategy. It was something colder, something that took shape without needing a form. And as Cleopatra stood beneath the great lintel carved with the names of ancestors, she realized that power didn't always require permission, only presence. She was already present, and everyone had begun to act accordingly. It was in a quiet antechamber off the Eastern Library, a room rarely visited, where dust coated even the hinges, that Cleopatra found the first letter. Not a royal decree, not a scroll filed for public record, but a folded parchment slipped between two ledgers on temple contributions, its edges worn not by age, but by the nervous fingers of someone who had handled it too many times. It bore no seal. No insignia marked it as official, but the handwriting, precise, deliberate, belonged to one of her brother's senior advisors, a man known not for insight, but for the careful precision with which he avoided risk. She had not come looking for secrets. The visit was routine, or rather, part of her routine, a habit of wandering to places the rest of the palace had stopped noticing. She moved like water through its halls now, soft and unobstructed, not by force, but by long familiarity. The Eastern Library had always been a place of small noise, the kind that soothed rather than demanded. She often came there to think, to study the ebb of tax records, or decipher temple stipends. But that day, the letter changed her pace. It changed the quality of the silence around her. She read it only once. That was all it took. It was written in code, a soft code, the kind built from phrasing more than cipher, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Her name was mentioned sparingly, always indirectly, as though invoking her too often might lend her power. There were references to shifting loyalties, to foreign inclinations, to a need for precaution before a precedent becomes tradition. There was mention of Rome, of a contact in Cyprus, of a proposed meeting not yet scheduled with a legate whose loyalties were known to tilt toward youth rather than seniority. The language was cautious. Nothing could be proven, nothing outright named. But in politics, meaning does not live in certainty. It lives in suggestion. And what this letter suggested was that while Cleopatra moved openly through the palace, decisions about her had already begun taking shape behind doors she no longer had the key to. She replaced the letter, not in the same place that would have signaled discovery. She slid it into a different ledger, unrelated, where it would not be easily found unless one already knew what to seek. That was the difference between panic and patience, the former alerts. The latter observes. She walked back to her chambers at a normal pace, spoke calmly to her attendants, asked that her evening garments be prepared early, though she had no plans to wear them. Then she waited. This, perhaps, was when her understanding of rule truly shifted. Until then, she had moved through the palace as a rightful figure, the co-ruler, the daughter of a king, the heir who had read the scrolls and kept her posture straight. But now she saw the architecture differently. Walls no longer simply supported. They also hid. Curtains no longer decorated. They listened. And every meeting, no matter how benign in its surface agenda, might be a rehearsal for something not yet named. That night, she dined alone in her study. Though several members of her advisory circle had asked for time, she refused all visitors, not out of withdrawal, but to study the response. Would anyone arrive uninvited? Would someone press further, or seem relieved at her silence? None did. The absence was telling. It confirmed more than words would have. The next morning, she requested an update from the chief archivist, not of her brother's correspondence, which would have raised suspicion, but of foreign grain imports over the past quarter. A minor topic, but one that would allow her to observe which hands delivered the ledgers, which eyes lingered too long on the notes. She noticed everything. The assistant who fumbled a name, the scribe who forgot her title in formal address, the corridor guard who, instead of bowing, offered only a glance. These were small things, too small to protest, but taken together, they became a pattern, the kind of pattern that suggests someone has begun practicing your removal before they've decided whether to make it official. Her brother, for his part, continued with his daily routine. Oblivious or pretending to be, he played at ruling, attending public audiences where decisions had already been made in his absence. He received tributes as if his hand had signed the letters that summoned them. Cleopatra watched him once from behind a lattice, not because she needed to see, but because she wanted to feel the distance. He smiled often, too often, and never at the right moments. She wondered if he understood what loyalty actually meant in a palace like this, that it was not something won by birth, or even by title, but by presence. And presence, in its truest form, meant consequence. When you spoke, did the world shift? When you remained silent, did people still respond? In that measure, she had already eclipsed him. That same week, an envoy from the city of Tmuis arrived to deliver a gift, an intricately carved box made of cedar and gold leaf, containing a model of the goddess Hathor, surrounded by 7 tiny animals, each representing one of the sacred constellations. The gift had been addressed to both Cleopatra and Ptolemy, but the envoy, when presenting it, turned first to her. When asked later, he explained that she had been the one to send the invitation, though her brother's seal had also been included. There was no protest from Ptolemy, not publicly, but the very next day, 2 of the palace guards assigned to her wing were reassigned. Their replacements were polite, deferential, and unfamiliar. You wondered, briefly, if the life of Cleopatra and her brother had ever truly been shared, or if the scroll bearing both names had always been a polite fiction, an emblem of balance drafted for foreign approval, never meant to survive the weight of real ambition. The palace no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage just before the curtain rises, where every prop must be adjusted and every breath rehearsed. Cleopatra walked with the awareness of someone who knows the scene might end mid-line, not with applause, but with a changed arrangement of actors. She did not confront her brother. That would have given shape to something she preferred to keep misted. Instead, she drafted a letter to a Roman official, one she had met years earlier during a ceremonial exchange. The letter was gracious, mild in tone, almost ceremonial in its phrasing, but it carried within it a single, unmistakable message. She was aware. She was still present, and she would not vanish quietly. She sealed the letter herself, choosing an emblem not used since her father's reign, a subtle callback, not for nostalgia, but to remind the reader that dynasties, too, have memories, and not all of them sleep. In theory, daylight was when things were decided. Decrees were issued in the mornings, audiences held at midday, officials assembled beneath the blazing glare of the sun to prove that governance was clear, visible, and orderly. But in Cleopatra's world, power did not move so directly. While her brother clung to the light to schedules, formalities, and appearances, she began to move more often in the spaces between, not because she feared confrontation, but because she understood that influence thrives in the margins. Ptolemy Thutmati's reign, to the extent it could be called his, depended heavily on the idea of visibility. He occupied the dais in the public square when foreign dignitaries passed through. He led ceremonial processions with measured pomp. He issued statements to the merchant guilds under the guidance of older men whose faces rarely revealed anything except caution. He believed, or perhaps had been taught to believe, that presence equaled legitimacy, that if the people saw him often enough, standing tall beside standards of gold, they would forget how rarely he spoke without prompting. Cleopatra, on the other hand, had begun avoiding the most public of appearances. She no longer accompanied her brother to civic rituals unless compelled. When she did attend, she remained composed but distant, watching more than engaging. Her advisors whispered that it was a strategic withdrawal, but the truth was more complex. She wasn't hiding, she was studying. She had learned that the spaces outside the spotlight were where the truest allegiances shifted, where servants passed rumors like folded linens, where tax collectors confessed their worries not in ledgers, but over shared bread with scribes, who passed through too often to be dismissed as decoration. The court still referred to them as co-rulers, but increasingly, they operated on different planes. Cleopatra's power began to concentrate in late afternoons, quiet gatherings in shaded gardens, long consultations with temple emissaries after sunset, whispered conversations in the shadowed alcoves of the archive halls. It wasn't secrecy she sought, it was resonance, the kind of dialogue that didn't need trumpets to matter. There were days when the two of them would pass each other only once, often in the colonnade, where light spilled through latticed windows in gold and dust bands. Their greetings, if exchanged at all, were brief and overly formal, the kind of tone siblings adopt when the bond between them has long been severed, but etiquette continues to drag the corpse. Once, Ptolemy tried to issue a decree, unilaterally a revision of trade policy with the northern ports. He drafted it with the help of his Roman-aligned counselors and sent it to be posted without her review. The papyrus made it to the public square, but within hours, Cleopatra had summoned the chief archivist, marked 3 sections with her seal, and dispatched a revised version, not as a correction, but as an amplification. She did not override him. She simply added language so specific and so finely woven that the meaning of the decree shifted entirely in her favor. He never questioned her directly. But that evening, a scroll was discovered missing from the palace's central library, one that had recorded the earliest co-rulership treaties from generations prior. It was never found. The assumption was that a servant had misplaced it. Cleopatra did not press the matter. She already knew which pages had been removed and what her brother hoped to prove by their absence. That night, as the palace prepared for the upcoming harvest ceremonies, Cleopatra met with a woman who did not officially serve in her court. She was the high priestess of Neith, rarely seen outside of Sais, and almost never granted access to the inner court without precedent. Yet there she was, cloaked in a robe dyed the blue of midnight, seated across from Cleopatra in a small garden chamber usually used by visiting scribes. They spoke of offerings, of course, and temple logistics, and regional politics, but they also spoke of omens, not the dramatic kind, with thunderclaps or comets, but the quieter ones, soil that turned differently beneath the plow, a statue that leaned imperceptibly in a shrine where no wind passed. These were signs the priestess had not shared with Ptolemy, not because he had not asked, but because he had not known what to ask. And that, more than anything, was why she had come to speak with Cleopatra. Some nights aren't long. They're just wide like a field no one crossed. Cleopatra listened without interrupting. Her gaze, usually steady, wandered once toward the vines curling along the edge of the colonnade. There was something about the way light filtered through those leaves, breaking into fragments, that reminded her of her father's study, the way he used to trace maps with a fingertip while muttering names of cities that had long since changed. The priestess, noting her moment of distance, paused and said, "Some names carry silence better than others." Cleopatra did not reply, but she remembered that sentence for years. Her brother continued to perform his duties in daylight, convinced that the crowd's gaze would preserve his place. He stood taller when soldiers bowed. He looked to the sun as if it endorsed him, but those around him had begun to look elsewhere. When decisions were made, people asked themselves what would she do, even if her name wasn't on the parchment. When orders were issued, scribes copied them in duplicate, one for the treasury, the other for the queen's records, even when she hadn't requested them. Cleopatra never declared authority. She did not need to. Her power resided in expectation. When she walked into a room, people anticipated clarity. When her brother entered, they braced for the need to interpret. At some point, a servant who once belonged to her father's personal household returned from the Fayum. He brought with him a series of hand-carved tokens, used in temple games, ivory discs inscribed with celestial symbols. Cleopatra remembered them from childhood, though she had never known what they were meant to represent. The servant explained they were part of a mnemonic ritual, a way to tell stories silently by rearranging them across a stone board. She took the set, thanked him, and placed them in the corner of her chamber. For weeks, she rearranged them before bed, not because she believed in prophecy, but because stories told without speaking sometimes revealed more than strategy ever could. She began to think of her rule not as an ascent, but as a quiet reclamation, not of her father's legacy, which had been compromised too many times, but of a voice that had never required elevation to be heard. And if the sun favored her brother, so be it. The corridors between sun and shadow were long, and in those corridors, she had learned to listen. In the months that followed, the palace became fluent in ambiguity. Every decision carried two explanations. Every silence suggested multiple meanings, and every document issued from the royal court bore the shape of agreement without the substance. The scrolls still named Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers, and the statues still stood beside one another in ceremonial gardens. But even the stone seemed to hold its breath now. There was a heaviness to the symmetry, the kind that suggested something was leaning, even if no one dared name it. The Royal Mint, located near the southeastern quarter of Alexandria, was among the last institutions to reflect this shift. Though, when it did, the result was subtle enough, in fact, to seem accidental. The new coinage bore both faces, as expected. On one side, the portrait of Ptolemy, rendered with a sharp jaw and a youthful gaze that exaggerated his seriousness. On the other, Cleopatra, her features slightly idealized, framed by the flowing curls that had become her visual signature. At first glance, the coins appeared balanced, equal, fair. But if one studied the alignment, a pattern emerged. Her face was struck slightly deeper, her profile more defined, her eye catching more light in certain conditions. No one acknowledged it openly, and yet it became a whispered observation among merchants and collectors alike. Cleopatra noticed the difference immediately. She did not comment. She simply held one of the new coins between her fingers for a moment longer than necessary during a meeting with her finance steward, then returned it to the tray without a word. That was how most of her authority moved in those days, not through confrontation, but through recognition. She had developed a way of speaking without assertion, of allowing meaning to settle around her like sediment in water, always there if one looked long enough. Ptolemy's counselors, ever vigilant for insult, brought the matter to his attention within the week. He, in turn, demanded to inspect the coinage himself. His anger, though real, was more about the implications than the details. The coins had been approved by his treasury, cast under the oversight of his own officials, and yet somehow they seemed to declare something beyond his reach, that while he occupied the throne, Cleopatra occupied the imagination of the kingdom. A debate followed. Should the mint recall the batch? Should new molds be made? His advisors split on the matter. Some argued that recalling the coins would signal weakness, that it would suggest they feared her growing influence. Others claimed the imagery could be dismissed as a printing inconsistency, an unfortunate accident, easily corrected in the next series. In the end, nothing was done. The coins remained in circulation, and the palace, as it often did, moved on without resolving the tension it carried. But Cleopatra understood what had happened, not just in metal, but in memory. Coins were more than currency. They were storytelling tools. They passed between hands, crossed borders, endured weather and war. A coin could outlive a reign, a rumor, even a name. And now her face was being carried into places where her voice had not yet reached. That mattered more than any speech. She began receiving letters from distant provinces that opened with her name alone, not in defiance of her brother, but in deference to familiarity. To Her Majesty the Queen. They began, or to Cleopatra. Philopator, these were not declarations of loyalty, but acknowledgments of reality. She was the one they had seen, the one whose image was on the coin passed at market, the one whose words reached them through decree or emissary. Her brother remained a presence, but not a voice. Within the palace, reactions to the coinage diverged. Among the older servants, those who had seen generations of rulers come and go, there was a quiet shift. Their courtesies grew more precise when addressing her. Their obedience, while always proper, took on a different quality, one not merely of obligation, but of alignment. They sensed the direction of gravity. In contrast, Ptolemy's personal guard grew more alert, more rigid in posture and tone. They began accompanying him more frequently, even into meetings where they were not required. His chamberlain once trailed him into a garden conference where only 3 others had been invited, citing matters of ceremonial import. It was not ceremony they feared, it was irrelevance. There was no confrontation, there was no pronouncement, but in that uneasy equilibrium, 2 names still printed side by side, 2 rulers still seated when required. There was an invisible countdown, not to war, necessarily, but to clarity. And clarity, in a divided palace, was always the most dangerous guest. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. One evening, Cleopatra hosted a private gathering in the southern wing, a part of the palace reserved for foreign dignitaries, but currently unoccupied. The guest list was narrow: scholars, regional governors, temple scribes, all people who had been essential to the flow of information, but rarely given formal presence. No announcement preceded the meeting. No agenda was shared. Yet every person arrived on time. They spoke not of rebellion, not of secession, but of continuity, of how the administration might ensure stability in the event of constitutional complexity, a phrase that meant everything and nothing. The tone was speculative, gentle, scholarly. But the questions had weight. Who would oversee grain flow if Ptolemy were indisposed? How would taxes be collected if signatures could no longer be shared? Which priesthoods recognized singular rule in matters of succession? The discussions were theoretical, entirely so, but each participant left with a deeper understanding of where the current truly flowed. A week later, Cleopatra received a gift from a local artisan, a gold medallion bearing her likeness alone. It had not been commissioned. It was not official, just a tribute. She placed it in a drawer and said nothing. But when she passed her brother in the corridor later that day, a rare and accidental encounter she noticed. The way his gaze lingered on her hands, as if trying to see what she might be holding or hiding. He said nothing. Neither did she. The coinage continued to circulate. Its weight was the same, its value unchanged, but across Alexandria and beyond, people began to recognize a quiet shift. One name still belonged to the state. The other had begun to belong to history. The banquet table had been lengthened once, perhaps twice, over the decades. Originally meant for a dozen advisors and a scattering of royal guests, it had grown with each new political accommodation, each faction that demanded its own cushion on the marble floor, each general or priest who required acknowledgement in the form of proximity. By the time Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII sat across from one another at its opposite ends, the table had become absurdly long, an exaggerated piece of furniture that made symbolic unity feel like a distant possibility rather than a practiced fact. The physical separation, though unintended at first, became a metaphor too perfect to ignore. When the court dined formally, which was increasingly rare, Their words had to be relayed through servants. Requests for more bread, for clarification of a toast, for a second cup of wine, all of it moved by way of human intermediaries. What should have been simple became strained, elongated, unnecessarily theatrical. Even their silences required interpretation. And though the protocol was respected, the effect was unmistakable. They no longer shared a table so much as endured its presence together. On the night of the spring equinox, a feast was held to honor the goddess Bastet. The excuse was religious, but the gathering was political. A Roman envoy had arrived in Alexandria several days earlier, accompanied by 2 aides and a letter bearing a seal. Cleopatra recognized immediately it belonged to a senator, known for favoring restorative balance in foreign monarchies, a phrase often deployed just before financial coercion. The senator's position was neither warm nor openly hostile, but it required attention, and appearances had to be managed. Thus, a banquet. The hall was dressed in linen banners dyed the soft red of late dusk, with silver bowls of water placed between every third guest, a nod to Bastet's association with protection, healing, and the quiet graces of peace. Musicians plucked lyres in the corners, scribes recorded every toast, servants moved with choreographed stillness, their feet gliding silently over the floor as if they had rehearsed this evening for weeks. Cleopatra arrived first, not by design, but because she had chosen to walk the garden path before entering a path her brother had never once set foot on. When she entered the room, those present rose instinctively, not because protocol demanded it, but because her presence seemed to alter the temperature. She wore a gown woven with fine gold thread, not ostentatious, but deliberate. It shimmered only when she moved. Her hair was bound back in the traditional style of Isis worshippers, invoking religious legitimacy without verbal declaration. She sat, greeted each guest with grace, and waited. Ptolemy entered 7 minutes later. He wore white, an awkward choice, given the evening's deep color tones, and though his robe had been freshly pressed, it did not suit him. His sandals, more suited for parade than comfort, clicked too loudly as he crossed the floor. Still, he was announced with the expected reverence, and the guests rose again, this time more out of necessity than instinct. He took his seat at the far end of the table and nodded once in her direction. Throughout the evening, conversation drifted like incense, pleasant, aromatic, and designed to obscure rather than clarify. The Roman envoy smiled often, raising his cup after nearly every sentence as if to ensure no words clung too tightly to meaning. Cleopatra responded with poise, steering topics toward Egypt's recent temple renovations, grain yields in the Delta, the smooth transition of regional authority to newly appointed governors. She used language that emphasized continuity, never change a tone that soothed foreign ears. Her brother said little. When prompted, he answered with generic affirmations, sometimes looking toward his advisors before replying. He laughed at the envoy's jokes, often a beat too late, and when the musicians played a traditional hymn, he clapped politely, though the rhythm escaped him. He was not inept, just distant, absent not in body, but in resonance. At one point, near the midpoint of the meal, the envoy turned to Cleopatra and offered a question in the tone of a compliment. How do you both find the balance to rule in concert, when so many kingdoms seem to falter under one voice alone? The table quieted. Though the question had been framed lightly, all eyes shifted, waiting for her answer. She smiled gently, as if amused by the simplicity of the inquiry. We share not only the throne, but its burden. That tends to divide the weight. Her brother nodded, slowly, then added, The burden is shared. Yes, though some hands are more practiced in its lifting. He meant it to sound gracious. It didn't. She did not respond directly. Instead, she turned to the envoy and raised her cup. In Egypt, we have long known that harmony is not uniformity. The Nile does not run straight, and yet it carries all of us. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just long enough to let the metaphor settle, and then conversation resumed. But from that point forward, the atmosphere changed. The laughter grew slightly too frequent. The servers poured wine more often than they should have. The musicians drifted toward quieter songs. No one said what they were thinking, but the tension moved like a second river beneath the first, unseen, but undeniably there. That night, long after the guests had departed and the halls had been cleared of perfume and leftover pomegranate, Cleopatra returned to her chambers without undressing. She stood by the lattice window, listening to the sounds of the harbor, the hollow creak of ropes against wood, the low murmur of sailors too far to see. She remained there until the moon had passed its peak, holding in her mind the image of the envoy's face as he looked between her and her brother, weighing what could not be spoken. Somewhere in the middle of that long table, power had begun to crystallize, not as a crown, but as an expectation, and once expectations take form, they rarely dissolve without event. In the morning, when the court awoke, nothing had changed. The scrolls still bore both names. The statues still stood. The table remained in place. But in the soft murmur of servants, in the glance exchanged between the steward and the scribe, in the quiet way that messages were routed, it was clear trust had not broken. It had simply folded itself away. And from that fold, something sharper had begun to emerge. It had always been there, the shadow of Rome, just behind the palm groves and the temple altars. Always just out of reach, yet never truly absent. At first it was the weight of a borrowed fleet, then a consul's patronage, then a treaty phrased carefully in the vocabulary of obligation. But by the time Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII shared a divided throne, Rome was no longer behind anything. It was leaning forward, elbows on the table, hands folded beneath its chin, watching with a kind of quiet appetite that only empires can afford. What Rome offered was never simply alliance or support. It offered attention, and attention, in the ancient world, was a currency more volatile than gold. Cleopatra understood this intimately. Her father had known it too, though he had played the Roman game with a desperation she did not intend to inherit. Where he had begged and bribed and borrowed his way into temporary favor, she preferred something quieter: alignment, insinuation, a kind of elegance in how she framed Egypt's value without ever allowing it to appear desperate for preservation. Rome, however, did not think in whispers. It thought in momentum, and momentum had brought a man named Pompey into the East. Pompey's presence was not yet physical. He had not set foot in Alexandria, but his influence was present in every conversation between Egyptian generals, in every scroll arriving from the West, bearing unfamiliar names with heavy signatures. Cleopatra had studied the Roman Senate long enough to know that Pompey was not merely a man of action, but a man of presence. He filled rooms even when he was not in them, and he inspired loyalty in the kind of men who never needed to be told why they were loyal. Egypt, in his mind, was not a kingdom, it was an opportunity. Her brother, or rather those who moved behind him, began to see in Pompey a possible insurance policy, not because they trusted him, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't pick a Roman before one picked them. And so, small gestures began. A letter, unsigned, a shipment of grain delivered slightly ahead of schedule to Roman outposts, an envoy from Ptolemy's camp who traveled with no official credentials but carried the phrasing of a diplomat. All of it quiet, all of it deniable. Cleopatra, of course, noticed. It was in the tone of the court more than in its paperwork, in the way her brother's advisors began deferring not to him, but to what they imagined a Roman mind would want, in the gradual disappearance of Egyptian idioms from their speech, in the subtle shifts of ceremonial language, the insertion of Latin phrasing into rituals that had long been rendered in Greek and Demotic. They were trying to translate themselves into something Rome might favor, believing that adaptation meant survival. But translation, she knew, could also mean erasure. One afternoon, as the Nile winds fell unusually still, and the sun pressed down upon the city with the weight of dry parchment, Cleopatra met with an advisor who had once served under her father, an old man with a cracked voice and a walking staff shaped like a heron. He had not been called upon for months, his presence seen as ornamental at best. Yet now, sensing the drift of things, he came unprompted. "You cannot outshout Rome," he told her, without preamble, "but you can outlisten it." She said nothing at first, but later that evening she had his pension increased, and the temple in which he had served given an extra allotment of oil. Rome was not one mind, and this was something Ptolemy's camp failed to grasp. They viewed the Republic as a single face, stern, male, invulnerable. Cleopatra, however, had begun studying the fractures, the alliances and rivalries within the Senate, the ambitions of men like Crassus and Caesar, the shifting tides of public favor that could elevate one commander and doom another by the time the Nile flooded again. She did not need to choose Rome, only to understand that Rome could be many things at once, and that choosing too soon meant choosing poorly. Still, Rome leaned in, and in the weeks following the Bastet feast, its presence grew heavier. Scrolls arrived bearing seals Cleopatra had not approved. Edicts were drafted citing Roman precedent, though no such citation had ever been made in prior years. Trade agreements were revised in her absence, favoring Roman merchants in Alexandria over Egyptian ones, despite her earlier efforts to establish parity. And when she questioned her brother, he responded not with hostility, but with indifference. "These are small adjustments," he said, eyes on the floor mosaic rather than her face. "Nothing that changes our course." But she recognized the tactic. Death by 1,000 permissions. Not a sword, but a slow descent into someone else's architecture. One where Egypt remained sovereign in name, but became merely a vessel for someone else's map. It wasn't that Ptolemy sought Rome's dominance. In truth, he lacked the imagination for empire, but those around him, the men who penned his speeches, arranged his banquets, whispered behind his silences, believed that proximity to Rome was power. They wanted to be seen at its table, even if only to serve. One of her aides, a young scholar named Theon, brought her a scroll one morning that bore the crest of a Roman equestrian, a man she had met briefly years earlier during a visit to the eastern ports. The message within was brief, polite, and absolutely unambiguous. "There are those in Rome," it read, "who believe the queen's wisdom lies not in her lineage, but in her choices, and that her future, if rightly placed, would echo far beyond the Nile." It was not a threat, it was a hand extended without a face. If anything in this stayed behind, you can leave something below, or not. It still counts. This is Boring History Nights. She read the message twice. Then she burned it, slowly, over a bowl of incense. The ashes were stirred into water and poured at the base of the garden's oldest olive tree, a symbolic act, perhaps, or just a gesture to remind herself that not all things written deserve preservation. From that point forward, her posture changed. She began taking more meetings privately, with fewer witnesses. She adjusted the court's flow of information, redirecting scrolls through alternate channels, shifting the routes through which foreign messages were reviewed. She met more frequently with her Egyptian advisors, men and women whose roots ran deeper than the reigns of any dynasty. And she had the portraits in the Western Hall, the ones showing past Ptolemy's clasping Roman hands covered with linen. Not removed, not destroyed, just hidden, for now. She knew the moment was coming, not confrontation, perhaps, but choice. Rome would not remain curious forever. Eventually, it would demand clarity, and when that happened, ambiguity would no longer be protection. But for now, she let the facade remain. Let Ptolemy's counselors believe they were steering the ship, while she traced the stars to determine where the current truly moved. Because Rome was not the only force that could lean, and she had learned long ago that sometimes the heaviest influence is the one that never declares itself. There had once been laughter in the palace gardens, not constant, but natural, rising and falling like wind through the myrtle hedges. During earlier years, before lines were drawn and every gaze interpreted, the gardens had offered a kind of neutrality. It was a place where the air smelled of wet stone and orange blossoms, where royal children could walk among the herbs without comment, and where even the guards leaned against the marble benches with the ease of men assigned to peace, not tension. But that time had passed, and now, even the wind moved cautiously through the leaves. On the third day of the month of Thoth, following an unusually silent council session, Cleopatra entered the western garden alone. The sun sat low and broad in the sky, turning the treetops a deep gold, though the stone paths below remained cool. She wore no crown, no formal sash, no retinue of attendants. Her only companion was the head scribe of the temple archives, a man named Nikutz, who walked slowly, and had mastered the art of saying nothing when nothing was safe to say. Their conversation that evening had no official subject. They discussed harvest patterns, the inconsistent behavior of the ibis this year, a fragment of poetry recently uncovered near the ruined library portico. But beneath the surface, both knew what this walk truly was: a signal. Cleopatra was making herself visible again, not as a queen in procession, but as someone who still moved freely within her own corridors. Her brother's camp had grown more formal lately, more closed. Invitations to private audiences had begun to arrive with an edge, laced with veiled scheduling conflicts and inopportune timings. Rumors had begun to swirl around the palace, not shouted, but repeated in careful tones. A cup of wine discarded untouched, a scroll delayed without explanation, and worst of all, an evening banquet postponed due to a sudden stomach ailment that only affected a single guest, a guest who had, only the day before, offered to revise a key trade agreement in Cleopatra's favor. She had not fallen ill, but she had noticed, and so the garden walk served its purpose. It showed those who still watched that she was not withdrawing. It allowed her to speak without paper and receive information without ink. But it also gave space to something unspoken, the suspicion that the palace was shifting from politics to danger. It began, as such things often do, with something that could be dismissed. That afternoon, a bowl of grapes had been sent to her chambers, accompanied by a folded scrap of parchment reading simply, "For her continued wisdom." The handwriting was familiar. The gift was unremarkable. The fruit, ripe and well arranged, bore no sign of tampering, but Cleopatra set it aside untouched. Later, when the maid returned, she asked where the grapes had come from. The answer was vague. From the southern orchard, as always, but the tone lacked conviction, and the servant's eyes lingered too long on the tray as it was removed. It wasn't the first time a pattern was forming. Weeks earlier, she had declined a cup of spiced wine during a formal supper. She hadn't suspected anything, but the taste had been wrong, too bitter at the back of the throat, too strong in a way that didn't match the mild fragrance. She'd smiled, passed the cup to a nearby servant, and requested water instead. The incident hadn't repeated, but since then, she had noticed her meals were arriving colder. Her chamber doors sometimes unlatched when they shouldn't be, and once, a torch near her bed had been left unlit, despite clear instructions. None of these incidents were decisive. None could be proven, and that was what made them dangerous. So now, walking through the garden where laughter had once softened the edges of power, she moved not with fear, but with calculation. Every step, every turn of her head was an answer to a question no one had yet asked. Nikutz kept beside her in silence. His presence gave the walk the air of routine. It let the watchers in the windows believe they were discussing documents or taxes or the proper phrasing of religious dedications. But they were discussing none of those things. At one point, near the sun-dappled fountain beneath the bitter orange tree, she paused. "If I were to disappear," she said, her voice low, but not soft. What would remain? A name, a coin, an unfinished treaty. Nick Coutts didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the sky, where a single ibis drifted alone against the fading blue. Some names, he said at last, don't finish, they echo. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood the offer in his response. He was reminding her that loyalty did not always need instructions, that sometimes it came quietly, a hand extended not in defense, but in witness. They resumed walking. That evening, after Nishoutz departed, she ordered that the fountain near the orange tree be drained and cleaned. No reason was given. The order was followed. The next morning, a silver goblet meant for her brother was found on the palace's northern balcony. It had not been used. It had not been scheduled. No one claimed to have placed it there. It was removed without comment, but the presence of it unexplained and gleaming in the morning light left a mark. Palace routines began to change. Servants looked twice before entering rooms. Advisors began requesting written confirmations for previously verbal agreements. The kitchens tightened their chains of command. The armory, usually quiet and forgotten, received 3 new guards. And still, no accusations were made. No poison was ever found. No illness ever confirmed. But everyone moved differently. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. Cleopatra remained composed, her posture, her gestures, her presence all unchanged. But beneath it, the recognition had settled. The palace was no longer merely contested. It was becoming unsafe. And what frightened her was not that someone might try to harm her. It was that, if they succeeded, there would be no outcry, just a quiet correction, a reshuffling of names and faces, perhaps even a well-written announcement. Her passing was sudden, peaceful. The gods are thanked for her service. It would be signed by her brother, sealed in the shape of continuity. So she prepared not loudly, not with armed guards or accusatory scrolls, but with presence. She began walking more often. She made herself visible in ways that could not be misinterpreted, standing in temples, attending small legal hearings, listening in the public square when merchants voiced their concerns. She became a figure of habit, not because it was safe, but because her disappearance would be harder to erase if her presence had been daily. She commissioned a series of religious offerings, one to Isis, one to Ma'at, one to Hathor. The dedications were formal, the donations generous, but the inscriptions on each altar bore a message that few would catch unless they looked closely. Each carried a variation of the same phrase: "The breath of the queen is still with the land." It was not a plea, it was a record, because when the garden no longer held laughter, one had to decide what memory to leave behind. By late summer, their words no longer aligned, not in tone, nor in timing, and certainly not in purpose. What had once been a shared voice, or at least a publicly coordinated one, had splintered into 2 distinct languages, each fluent in a different version of rule. Cleopatra, with her measured speech and careful metaphor, had begun speaking not to the court, but through it to foreign ears, to temple records, to the silent audience that history always promises but never confirms. Her brother, meanwhile, responded only when necessary, and then only through the prepared statements of others. His decrees were brief, concrete, and dusted with borrowed authority. They felt less like guidance and more like interruptions. She understood the value of softness. It was not weakness, but a kind of persuasive strength, the ability to let others believe they had chosen what she had already decided. Her words wrapped themselves in layers, cultural references, shared history, subtle invocations of religious imagery. She quoted the gods with the casual authority of someone who had actually listened for their silence. And her garments, her posture, her timing, everything about her delivery was deliberate, not performative, but precise. When Cleopatra addressed the temple councils, she didn't just speak, she aligned herself with continuity. She referenced agricultural patterns, not tax codes. She reminded the priests of lunar eclipses that had coincided with royal births, of storms that had broken when certain names were uttered. Her speeches folded Egypt into itself, as if every listener had always belonged to the narrative she offered. It was not deception, it was structure, and it worked. Ptolemy, on the other hand, preferred clarity, or more accurately, the illusion of it. His statements, often brief and reactionary, bore the fingerprints of his Roman advisors. They focused on regulation, trade deficits, militia reports. They avoided metaphor. They avoided anything that could not be tallied. When he spoke, the sentences arrived like clay bricks, rectangular, weighty, stackable, but never luminous. There was a kind of administrative efficiency to it, but no one leaned closer when he began. What emerged between them wasn't conflict in the traditional sense. It was tone, rhythm, texture, where she moved like silk, graceful. Shifting with the shape of the moment, he grounded himself in the inflexibility of protocol. He relied on precedent, even when it no longer served him. His decrees sounded like they had been issued 2 years earlier and had only just found their way to the light. And when questioned, he insisted on answers that resembled statements, never invitations. The difference became especially clear during the Feast of Offerings, an annual event in which the ruler presented symbolic gifts to the Nile, both to honor the river's generosity and to affirm their fitness to guide the kingdom. The ritual had always been split between ceremonial symbolism and actual logistics. Cleopatra chose to present a woven sash dyed with crushed pomegranate and indigo, embroidered with fragments of hymns to Hapi, the Nile god. The sash was then wrapped around a clay vessel filled with herbs, oil, and grain, and floated downstream at dawn. Ptolemy presented a copper weight inscribed with his full royal name, accompanied by a list of temple donations etched in stone. When the offerings were sent downriver, the crowd observed both. But when the winds changed direction and the water shifted, it was Cleopatra's sash that caught the breeze. It fluttered, turned, and drifted forward ahead of the heavier copper. The priests said nothing. They didn't need to. In quiet moments afterward, people whispered that the river had chosen. It wasn't that her brother lacked presence. He still commanded a segment of the court, still received petitions, still issued rulings. But those around him began to treat his authority like scaffolding, necessary to maintain the structure, but not part of what truly held it together. Cleopatra's voice, meanwhile, had become part of the building itself. It echoed in the places where decisions lingered, and she began to sense this change in the smallest of ways. Temple artists began sketching her face more often than his when drafting mural plans. Local magistrates requested clarification on her policies, even when they had already received his. Servants in the royal kitchens adjusted their menu schedules based on her preferences, not his. Even the palace dogs, which had once followed both siblings without discrimination, now trailed behind her more frequently, resting at her feet when she paused in the shade. He noticed, of course, or at least he noticed the symptoms. He began requesting audiences with officials who had not been summoned. He corrected ceremonial titles with increasing frequency. He issued edicts reaffirming customs that no one had questioned. He gave orders more forcefully, but to fewer people. At one council session, when a foreign envoy requested clarification on a border dispute, Cleopatra responded with a long, careful explanation that referenced 2 historical treaties, 3 regional customs, and a myth involving the goddess Nephthys. Ptolemy, visibly strained, responded by stating simply, "The borders remain as they were." The room fell into a silence that had nothing to do with resolution. That evening, as Cleopatra walked the lower hallways where the scrolls were stored, she came across a group of scribes transcribing new tax codes. They looked up briefly as she passed, then returned to their work not hurriedly, not deferentially, but with the comfort of routine. She realized with a kind of weary clarity that her presence no longer caused disruption. It was not a thing to prepare for, nor a signal of pending change. It was expected. She was no longer becoming something. She simply was. And her brother, who had once walked with her through those same hallways, still young and unsure, asking about the names of gods painted on the columns, now walked alone, or not at all. When she returned to her chambers, she found a scroll waiting. It was unsigned, written in a careful hand. It said only, "He speaks in dust, you speak in breath. One is buried, the other fills the room." She did not try to find out who had sent it. She did not need to, because by now, the air itself was telling her the same thing. The throne room had not changed in stone, but it had shifted in meaning. The gilded lions at its entrance still flanked the long corridor with their sculpted stillness. The papyrus motifs still bloomed along the walls, and the canopy overhead remained heavy with the weight of ceremonial banners. But what the room meant, how it breathed, who it served, had begun to dissolve into ambiguity. Where once the twin thrones had represented a shared dynasty, a lineage forged in compromise and tradition, now they stood as twin symbols of imbalance. One was not raised higher, not visibly but over time. The body language of the court, the rhythm of arrivals and departures, the quiet choreography of glances and bows, all tilted in a single direction. And Cleopatra noticed, not because she longed for superiority, but because she was fluent in space, in posture, in how power quietly rearranges the furniture of a room long before it rearranges its rulers. When she entered, the courtiers now stood straighter, not in alarm, but in readiness, not because they feared her, but because they had come to expect that something would be decided. And when she sat, even though the throne was no taller, no more adorned than her brother's, it was understood somehow, imperceptibly, that hers was the seat people turned to first. She remembered when this had not been the case. In the earlier years, even as she learned to speak in 3 languages and write in 4, even as she memorized temple rites and trade routes, she had been the one who sat lower, if not physically, then symbolically. Her voice had needed to be justified, her presence preemptively explained. At court gatherings, she was often introduced after her brother, despite being older and more informed. When envoys addressed the royal siblings, they had instinctively addressed him first, deferring to the boy who bore the title with fewer qualifications but more inherited formality. But that had changed not through a single act, not through open conflict, but through accumulation. 100 gestures over 1,000 days, the way her answers outlasted his declarations, the way her silence commanded more attention than his certainty, the way her every word arrived already weighed and accepted, while his had begun to feel like afterthoughts, edits to a version of the world already narrated. Yet the throne itself hadn't moved. It remained where it had always stood, side by side with its twin, identical in material, in craftsmanship, in height, and still, it cast a longer shadow. What had begun to concern Cleopatra more than her own ascent was the behavior of those who now danced awkwardly between the 2 thrones. Advisors who once served both began to mirror her diction, shaping their words to match her rhythm. Temple officials brought her prayers before the ink on her brother's signatures had dried. Foreign merchants increasingly arrived bearing gifts that matched her known preferences, citing allegiances to the crown without specifying whose. Her brother did not respond outwardly. He still occupied his place during public ceremonies. He still signed treaties and met with commanders, but he had begun to hesitate in ways that betrayed an erosion beneath the surface. He fumbled ritual lines that had once flowed easily from his mouth. He asked for clarifications on matters he had previously understood. Most noticeably, he no longer looked at her when she spoke. Instead, he watched the faces of others, perhaps hoping to catch a flicker of confusion, a hesitation he could use to reassert himself. But there were none. During one particularly significant tribunal, where the redistribution of land along the Western Canal was being debated. Both siblings were expected to preside. The room was full governors, land stewards, foreign observers from Crete and Cyprus. The air was thick with incense and expectation. Cleopatra arrived on time, seated herself, reviewed the documents, and nodded once to the steward to begin. Ptolemy arrived late. He entered with the same measured pace he always employed, but something about it felt strained. He did not look at the guests. He took his seat and, without a word, adjusted the folds of his robe. When the first petition was read, Cleopatra responded with a quiet question that reframed the entire conversation, asking whether the previous canal tax had been adjusted after the last flood season. The room fell into a thoughtful hush. Several stewards began rechecking their notes. Her brother said nothing. When the second petition was read, Cleopatra remained silent. She allowed Ptolemy the space to respond, and he did formally, clearly, but without confidence. He cited the standard code, reaffirmed the existing land rights, and closed the matter without comment. The stewards nodded, though without enthusiasm. And then, as the third petition was read, something small but unmistakable happened. One of the Cypriot observers, an older man with silver earrings and a narrow gaze, leaned slightly toward Cleopatra's end of the dais, as though to catch her reaction. His posture was neither urgent nor disrespectful. It simply assumed that if an insight came, it would come from her side. That lean, subtle as it was, changed everything. Ptolemy noticed. Everyone did. After the tribunal, he did not linger. He departed through the eastern hallway, flanked by two advisors who whispered without pause. Cleopatra remained, accepting quiet questions from three of the governors, none of which were rerouted to her brother's office. Later that night, alone in her chamber, she sat not at her writing desk, but near the window that overlooked the inner court. The thrones, now empty, were still visible through the columns, lit by torchlight. They glowed faintly, like paired statues in a shrine that had lost its congregation. She wondered whether it had been her brother's idea to resist, or whether he had simply inherited someone else's fear. Was it ambition that had led him to hollow out his own presence? Or was it the quiet exhaustion of standing beside someone who refused to shrink? Not every silence is empty. Some were designed that way, on purpose. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of power's geometry. You could share a throne, mirror someone in posture and title, and still find that the shape of your absence became more pronounced the longer you remained seated. In the days that followed, she began to notice how often her throne was already warmed when she arrived. Advisors lingered near it longer. Servants paused more carefully when placing letters on its armrest. Even the royal dog circled it twice before settling. She did not move it. She did not elevate it. She let it remain precisely as it was, because the throne itself had never mattered, only the shadow it cast. And now, everyone had seen where that shadow fell, in the palace's northern gallery, where the stone floor stayed cool no matter the season. A long wall was reserved for painted likenesses of the ruling house, not idealized gods or ancestral myths, but real faces, rendered in wax pigment and tempera, hung in chronological order like an unfolding memory. These portraits were not always flattering. They were not meant to be. They were records, fragments of power pressed onto wood and pigment, meant to assert continuity more than glory. Each generation placed itself beside the last, and the result was a silent procession of brows and mouths and postures, echoing through centuries. But somewhere in that sequence, precisely where the images of Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII should have appeared, there was a deliberate absence. The space was not empty. That would have been too jarring, too obvious. Instead, it had been filled with something that claimed neutrality, a tapestry woven with symbolic patterns, stars and lotus flowers, the eye of Horus flanked by symmetrical falcons. It was beautiful. It was meaningless. Everyone understood what it meant. They had never sat for a portrait together. not formally, not as a pair. Early drafts had been commissioned, sketches requested by the court artists during their first year of co-rule. But no final piece had ever been completed. The painters had waited for the right moment, a public triumph, a festival, a diplomatic achievement, something that would mark the pair as a unified force. But the moment never came. Meetings were postponed, sittings rescheduled. Eventually, without declaration, the project faded from expectation. Cleopatra had not inquired. Her brother had not insisted. And so the wall remained intact, the sequence technically unbroken, and yet everyone could feel the fracture behind the thread. It wasn't just a matter of vanity. These portraits were visual anchors, narrative devices that allowed future generations to point and say, "There, that's when it happened." But without an image, there was no such reference, only stories, only interpretations. It was one of the few places in the palace where the absence of something had more power than its presence. And Cleopatra, despite everything, did sometimes wonder what that portrait might have looked like had they sat side by side, had they chosen to embody the myth instead of unraveling it. There had been one attempt, years earlier, during the Feast of Renewal. A court artist named Polykleitos, imported from Corinth for his reputation with difficult sitters, had proposed a dual image the queen and king painted, not in profile but facing each other, hands not touching but extended in mirrored gesture, robes blending at the edges. It was stylized, more symbolic than literal, intended to suggest balance and shared strength. Cleopatra had agreed to the sketch. Her brother had not. He said the gesture made it look as if she were offering him something, or worse, taking something away. Polykleitos returned to Corinth within the month. Now, as Cleopatra walked the gallery alone, something she did increasingly often, in the quiet before dusk, she paused where the tapestry hung. The cloth barely shifted in the breeze from the high window, but its stillness was irritating, not because of what it covered, but because it dared to pretend it wasn't a cover at all. She traced her gaze along the other portraits. Her father, with his drooping eyes and faint smirk; her grandfather, rigid and formal; the queen from 3 generations ago, whose face had been preserved with such care that Cleopatra sometimes imagined speaking to her. All of them fixed in time, all of them occupying the wall as though they had never been uncertain, never been contradicted. And she thought not for the first time how little truth portraits ever contained. Faces might linger in pigment, but meaning came from posture, from what lay just outside the frame. Who else had been in the room? What had been said before the brush was lifted? A painted gaze never blinked, never admitted doubt. It only watched, forever unaware of what came next. Perhaps that was why she had never insisted on their joint image, because something in her had already known it would be a lie. Her brother, meanwhile, had commissioned a separate portrait, one completed quietly, with little fanfare. It hung in the inner corridor outside his council chamber, shielded from the public but still visible to those who sought his permission. The portrait showed him seated, alone, one hand resting on the hilt of a sword, the other on a scroll. The symbolism was deliberate strength and law, tradition and command. But the scroll was blank. That had not been intentional. The artist, rushed for time, had intended to return and inscribe a Latin quotation, something borrowed from Cicero or Livy. The addition never happened. The scroll remained unmarked. It became, unintentionally, the truest part of the painting. One of Cleopatra's aides, upon seeing it, remarked with a hint of irony, "The silence is well executed." She didn't laugh, not because the joke failed, but because the truth in it was heavier than amusement. Over time, she began to consider the tapestry not as an absence, but as a placeholder, not for what had been, but for what might yet be decided. After all, a portrait could still be commissioned. Images could be created after the fact. The court artists, especially the younger ones, had long since mastered the art of producing likenesses from nothing more than old wax molds and a few verbal descriptions. Legitimacy was often painted backward, constructed to match the ending, not the beginning. But she had no desire for invention. What unsettled her was not that no portrait existed. It was that none had ever been attempted in earnest, that from the beginning, their co-rule had never even pretended to be unified enough to require one. There had been no illusion to maintain, no story to sculpt, only a silence so symmetrical it had come to resemble strategy. And now, the court no longer asked when the joint portrait would appear. Even the oldest scribes had stopped referencing it. The space on the wall remained, but no one expected it to be filled. As she left the gallery, footsteps echoing lightly beneath the painted ancestors, she felt neither sorrow nor pride, only a strange calm, the kind that follows the acknowledgement of something already decided long ago. The past, she thought, was not built from the things we do, but from the things we refuse to imagine together. And the girl who had once sat lower on the throne now walked alone through a hallway of faces, each one telling its story in quiet agreement that her own would be drawn differently if it were drawn at all. There was no proclamation, no ceremony, no audience called to witness a decision, no priest lit incense, no herald recited lineage. The event did not even have a date. But when Cleopatra stepped onto the ship that would carry her from Alexandria's royal harbor, her absence had already begun to reshape the court she left behind. What unfolded was not an exile in the traditional sense, not a forced march, not a public disgrace, but something more insidious, a quiet removal disguised as inevitability. It began, as these things often did, with paperwork. A change in the steward's distribution list meant that a crucial set of temple grants never reached Cleopatra's desk. A shipment of grain was rerouted through a harbor she had never approved. Foreign envoys who once scheduled appointments through her chief scribe were redirected to her brother's offices politely, efficiently, without comment. These were not confrontations. They were omissions, engineered to appear logistical. To raise protest would have been to seem petty. To ignore them was to invite more. She did neither. She observed. And when she saw the line forming a line not of soldiers or guards, but of decisions, she understood what was happening before anyone spoke aloud what they had been trying not to say. Her presence had become inconvenient to the version of Egypt her brother's advisors now envisioned, not because she failed to lead, but because she did so too clearly. The palace no longer wanted a second voice. It wanted one, and it wanted that voice to sound predictable. The final signal came in the form of an invitation, a letter sealed with the symbol of the crown, but worded as though addressed to someone peripheral. It invited her to attend a seasonal inspection of the eastern provinces, citing the need to reinforce trust in the stability of royal administration. There was no lie in it, but no warmth either. The kind of suggestion that is not a request, and not quite a command. Her brother's name was not on the letter. His seal was. The message was not lost on her, nor was the implication that her continued presence in Alexandria was no longer welcome, or at least no longer advantageous to those who had aligned themselves behind the throne's other occupant. And so she departed, not in anger, and not with spectacle. She boarded her barge before sunrise, when the harbor was still mostly empty and the only sound came from the creak of wet wood and the faint jangle of chains pulled taut. Her retinue was small, a few loyal scribes, several personal guards, 2 of her younger attendants who had been with her since childhood. The barge bore no royal insignia, only a painted falcon on its stern. She did not look back at the lighthouse. She had memorized its shape long ago. What followed was not exactly exile. She was still a queen, still addressed as such in official correspondence. The territories she visited received her with protocol. Offerings were made. The songs sung in her honor had not changed, and yet something underneath it had shifted. It was not her status that had been diminished, but her proximity. Distance was a tool, and those who remained behind were counting on time and space to do what no decree could safely accomplish. At each stop along the river, Cleopatra observed the same polite choreography. Regional governors greeted her with crisp smiles and carefully prepared gifts. Temple scribes presented scrolls already transcribed. Local musicians played arrangements chosen not for her taste, but for their inoffensiveness. She was honored, but not expected. Welcomed, but not needed. It was a role designed to preserve the appearance of inclusion, without the risks of actual influence. And yet, even from afar, her presence began to interfere with the narrative being constructed in Alexandria. News traveled slower outside the capital, but it traveled. Merchants still mentioned her name. Priests still invoked her lineage during rituals. Children recited verses about the queen who walked beside the Nile. It turned out that proximity was not the only kind of power. Memory, too, could be sharp. In Elephantine, where the stone temples caught the sky in mirrored fragments, she met with a cohort of scholars who had preserved astronomical records older than the dynasty itself. They offered her charts, calculations, prophecies drawn from the movement of stars. One of them, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers, placed a brittle scroll in her hand and said, without looking up, "There is time yet for the shape to change." He did not say what shape. He did not need to. She did not write to her brother during this time, nor did he write to her. Their silence was not cold, it was crafted, a silence that acknowledged itself, like two actors who step off stage at the same time but walk in opposite directions. The kingdom continued. The harvest came, taxes were collected, scrolls were filed. But the throne room, she suspected, felt hollow in a way that no decree could fill. One evening, as her barge drifted slowly near Hermopolis, the sky dimming in shades of copper and gray, she walked alone to the rear of the vessel and sat beside the oarsman. She had done so often as a girl, when her father still ruled, and the river felt like something ancient and unconcerned. She remembered him once telling her, "The Nile doesn't choose sides. It only remembers who stepped into it." That night, she wrote nothing. She issued no orders. Instead, she let the sound of the river speak where language would only clutter. She was not defeated, nor was she resigned. She was waiting. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. Back in Alexandria, the court continued its polite charade. Ptolemy attended ceremonies with the appropriate solemnity. His advisors stood behind him like pillars in a hall they had quietly redesigned. They spoke of continuity. They emphasized stability. The phrase "the enduring crown" began to appear in official correspondence. But beneath the surface, the absence echoed. There were decisions that stalled because no one wanted to be the one to replace her judgment. There were problems that deepened because those who had silenced her had not learned to listen. And eventually, there were whispers not loud, but persistent, that perhaps she had not been exiled after all, that perhaps this departure was not punishment, but preparation, that her stillness was not surrender, that her silence was deliberate. She had not named her banishment, and so no one else dared to, which meant that her return, if it came, could be shaped on her terms. And history, as always, would accept whichever story was told first, as long as it was told well enough. She returned not with legions or fanfare, but with a silence even sharper than the one she had left behind. It was not triumph, not yet, but there was a shift in the air as her barge moved past Alexandria's harbor markers and slowed at the landing, where scribes once bowed without question. No horns blew, no proclamation was read, but word traveled faster than ceremony. Within hours of her arrival, market chatter had changed tone, and within days, the palace, though it did not say her name aloud, began to adjust itself in anticipation. This was not a coup, it was a reappearance. During her absence, Her brother's rule had not unraveled, not entirely. On paper, everything had held. Laws were recorded, taxes processed, festivals honored. Yet the crown had not quite sat still. There were cracks invisible to courtiers, but not to the populace. Temple offerings had waned. Merchants argued over tax discrepancies in the open. One governor had quietly begun to correspond directly with Rome, bypassing the palace entirely. The sense of order remained, but its soul had grown hollow. It had the shape of government without the breath of authority. Cleopatra stepped into this vacuum as though stepping into a garment she had never truly taken off. She did not issue a single royal decree in the first fortnight of her return. She did not enter the throne hall. She did not request an audience with the council. Instead, she began visiting archives, walking barefoot through the oldest wings of the palace library, rereading the treatises her father once consulted before council votes. She sat with astronomers beneath the dome of maps and asked them what seasons were shifting and what winds might delay Roman ships. She invited a quiet procession of lesser priests and minor scribes people, with no titles and no allegiances, to eat with her in the side garden, where jasmine still grew between the tiles. She asked questions. She listened. Her brother, meanwhile, said little. His advisors issued reports that made no mention of her. His presence in the palace became more ceremonial, his speeches increasingly ornate, as if to compensate for the absence of clarity. Whenever Cleopatra's name was uttered, it was with an odd formality, as though referring to someone who had passed into myth but had somehow returned intact. The fiction of regency was maintained for the sake of dignity. Officially, Ptolemy still ruled, and she still served beside him. Unofficially, the direction of rule began to tilt. Temple donations resumed at pre-exile levels. The chief architect, who had stalled projects for nearly a year, resumed plans for a new harbor beacon after a brief and private audience with Cleopatra. Even the Roman envoys, cautious and practiced in ambiguity, began requesting her presence in meetings that were previously reserved for her brother. The irony of it all was that her authority grew not from the loudness of her return, but from the quiet of her resilience. By allowing the palace to believe she had been erased, she had shown them what her absence meant. By not fighting the removal, she made her reinstatement seem inevitable. And still, she did not press. She was careful not to lean too far into power before it was ready to welcome her fully. Power, after all, was not a coin to be seized, but a current to be ridden. She had learned this from the Nile. You do not conquer a river. You move with it until you find the right place to step ashore. Behind her poise, though, was calculation. Her actions were not the result of passivity, but precision. Every appearance was chosen, every silence calibrated. Her gaze in court meetings rarely lingered. Her fingers, when folded, betrayed nothing. But beneath that stillness was a woman measuring every ripple, and the ripples began to widen. One morning, when the palace roof glowed pink with the rising sun, and the guards were still shifting into their day posts, Cleopatra walked alone into the lesser throne chamber, not the grand one used for coronations, but the one her father had preferred, where the columns were low and the stone felt cool even in summer. She did not summon an audience. She simply entered, stood by the seat not currently in use, and read from a parchment she had carried since before her return. It was a revised trade route agreement, a document that had been delayed by 2 years of court indecision. She read it slowly, deliberately, as if no one were watching, and when she was done, she handed it to a clerk and left the room. By mid-morning, 4 regional governors had already received copies, stamped with her seal. It was not a coup, but it was no longer regency either. Her brother, sensing the shift, made no move to challenge it. Perhaps he believed that saying nothing preserved his dignity. Perhaps he hoped that time would again weaken her hold, as it had once before. Or perhaps he understood too late that this time she had returned not only with her presence, but with the loyalty of a court that had tired of uncertainty. Still, she did not move to strip him of his title or place. She allowed him to remain visible, a figurehead behind which she could maneuver with greater freedom. Let the world believe Egypt had two rulers. Let the Romans write their reports in careful, balancing language. Let the Alexandrian poets speak of dual suns above the throne. The truth needed no announcement. It only needed time. And time finally was on her side. She began spending her evenings in the Temple of Isis, a place that had always held personal meaning for her, but now served as more than a retreat. Here, she conferred with priests about rebuilding ritual processions that had been simplified or suspended during her brother's rule. She reviewed legal petitions brought by women and artisans, signing scrolls that had long languished unanswered. She walked through the temple kitchens and counted grain herself. It was not about control, it was about presence. The people noticed. Word spread. Her brother withdrew further. He still appeared in official paintings, his face solemn and appropriately divine. But behind closed doors, his influence began to diminish. There were whispers that his own scribes preferred Cleopatra's rhythms, that his guards sometimes responded to her gestures more instinctively than his. The coins still bore both their names, but the weight behind those names had shifted. And still, she called it nothing. No title, no declaration, no throne claimed. She let the world define it however it wished. But within herself, she knew what it was. It was survival. Survival in a world designed to erase her. In a palace trained to favor sons. In a history already being drafted by foreign hands. She would not call it victory. Victory was loud and brittle, and often temporary. What she had built instead was something quieter, deeper, a form of rule that did not need to shout to endure. And when the time came, as it always does, for another change, another threat, another tide to rise, she would be ready. She had already done the hardest part. She had stayed. The dust had not yet settled from the previous shifts of power, when the sound of returning hooves echoed across the stone-paved courtyard. There were no heralds, no processional incense, just a breeze that carried rumors faster than guards could close the gates. After months of absence, whether strategic withdrawal or enforced retreat, Ptolemy returned to Alexandria under the pretense of restoration, though there was little left for him to restore. The throne he had once shared in name had grown quiet under his silence, and in that quiet, his sister's voice had reshaped the rhythms of the court. He dismounted with dignity, but not with authority. The crowd that gathered near the harbor walls did so not to welcome him, but to witness the aftermath. It was not that he was despised. It was worse, he was irrelevant. While Cleopatra had wielded power with deliberate elegance, threading her influence through every corridor of the palace and every grain tally across the Nile Delta, her brother's absence had hollowed his claim. The people still remembered the long nights of indecision under his regency, the endless meetings where no conclusion came, the faceless advisors who spoke more often than the boy king himself. Now he returned to a kingdom whose architecture no longer bent toward him. The pillars did not echo his footsteps, as they once did. The council room where he had once sat in a position of ceremonial prominence had shifted its gravity. The scribes still bowed, but their parchment bore Cleopatra's seal. The guards still offered him respect, but their loyalty leaned ever so slightly toward the woman who had fed them through drought, who had kept the grain flowing when Rome threatened to hold its coin. It is not that Ptolemy was powerless. On paper, his title held. His face still adorned the silver tetradrachms that passed hand to hand through the markets of Alexandria. But even he knew that titles did not command allegiance. Only presence did. And presence was something Cleopatra had mastered in his absence. He requested an audience. It was granted, but not in the great hall of marble lions where pharaohs once passed judgment. Instead, he was received in the smaller chamber with papyrus blinds that rustled in the afternoon breeze. a room chosen not for intimidation, but for clarity. She did not rise to greet him. She did not lower her gaze either. She simply looked, steadily, as if measuring whether this return was an act of reconciliation or simply the latest ripple in a tide she had already learned to sail. Ptolemy spoke first, not out of courage, but because silence, for once, did not serve him. He began with courtesy, naming her co-ruler, using all the appropriate forms and phrases drilled into him since childhood. But the words fell flat. They were museum phrases, spoken in a gallery already recurated by someone else. He offered assistance, proposed unity, spoke of the burden of rule as a shared endeavor, yet every sentence sounded like a request for permission rather than a statement of intent. She listened without interrupting, her fingers resting lightly on the arms of her seat, a ring of turquoise glinting in the filtered light. When he finished, she responded not with rhetoric, but with the weight of practical reality. The grain routes had been rerouted successfully. The treasury's new ledgers showed a surplus. Rome's latest correspondence named her, and her alone, in the lines of diplomatic address. The temple at Philae had been rededicated in her name with the approval of priests long hostile to dynastic politics. These were not accusations. They were facts. And facts, unlike politics, did not beg for compromise. She did not deny him his place. She simply left no space where it still mattered. Still, she offered him a role. It was ceremonial, something befitting a Ptolemy, yet safely distant from the levers of actual command. A regent in name, a figurehead for festivals, a visible heir to divine legacy, but not to policy. It was both an insult and a kindness, though which outweighed the other depended on one's pride. For Ptolemy, it was a compromise he could neither wholly reject nor wholly embrace. To walk away from it would be to vanish entirely. To accept it would be to accept that his sister now ruled, not beside him, but before him. In the weeks that followed, he lingered in the palace like a ghost of an older regime. He smiled when addressed in public. He signed documents prepared for him, though never drafted by his hand. He attended rituals in ornate linen and gold, waving to crowds who barely remembered his voice. He became a living statue animated only by obligation and adorned only by history. Meanwhile, Cleopatra pressed forward, with Rome growing ever more entangled in its own wars and ambitions. She strengthened Egypt's independence without directly defying the empire. Her brother's return allowed her to appear balanced, respectful of tradition, while in truth, she operated with near total control. She invited foreign scholars to her court. She commissioned repairs to irrigation systems neglected under previous oversight. She gave audience to merchants who once bribed their way into hearings, now listened to without fear. And she did so without spectacle. Her rule was not thunder. It was pressure, layered and constant, the kind that reshapes stone not by breaking it, but by refusing to release it. Her brother had returned too late, not just in time, but in comprehension. He had not understood that power was not a favor to be granted by bloodline. It was an atmosphere cultivated by labor, presence, and precision. He began spending more time outside the palace, seeking diversion in the Delta's quieter estates, sailing along the old royal routes with a dwindling entourage. There were no declarations of departure, no formal retirement. He simply became more distant. A brother remembered more often in footnotes than in decisions. And Cleopatra never pushed him away. She simply no longer needed to draw him close. The court adjusted with quiet efficiency. His name remained on formal edicts, but was spoken less and less in conversation. Foreign dignitaries addressed their letters to the Queen of Egypt, no longer appending and her brother. The coins would take longer to change. Metal always lags behind power. But even there, rumors swirled of new dies being cast, portraits reshaped, inscriptions reworded. In time, his shadow faded not with violence, not with exile, but with the slow erosion that comes from being gently but firmly eclipsed. And still, Cleopatra spoke no ill of him. She allowed history to remember him in the way it wished neither villain nor martyr, but simply as one who stood beside power without ever quite understanding its weight. For her, it was enough. He had returned too late to change the course, but just in time to confirm it. In a palace where names once rang like bells through the courtyards, Ptolemy's became an echo that thinned with each passing moon. At first, it was subtle, a clerk omitting a title in casual speech, a scribe favoring his sister's monogram when carving reliefs in temple walls. But silences have a rhythm of their own, and in time, the omission of his name grew into a custom, then a courtesy, and eventually, a kind of rule. Cleopatra did not issue decrees forbidding his name. She did not need to. The court had learned the language of power not from words, but from gestures, from the way her presence filled space more completely with each day, from the way decisions now bore only her voice, her ink, her weight. The palace, once designed to reflect dual rulership, was now a singular instrument, and it played her melody with seamless precision. Ptolemy's seat remained in the hall, but the cushions were never warmed. When ceremonies were held, his regalia were set aside in careful preparation, but left untouched by flesh. The courtiers adjusted quickly, as they always had men and women who had learned to keep their futures intact by aligning themselves with the rising sun. In private, some whispered that the prince had withdrawn by choice. Others insisted he had merely accepted the natural current of fate. Few believed he had ever possessed the will to resist it. And among the younger officials, there were even those who no longer remembered his role in statecraft, only his ceremonial appearances, cloaked in distant smiles, like an actor who had long since forgotten his lines but still bowed when the curtain dropped. Cleopatra, for her part, neither hastened his erasure nor hindered it. She had no need to destroy what would decay on its own. Her governance had moved beyond the need to prove authority. It simply was. The affairs of the kingdom were conducted in her name, and the Nile flowed as if it, too, had chosen a sovereign. Festivals bore her likeness on banners. Poets turned her presence into verse. Priests once skeptical of her rule now bent more easily. If not out of belief, then out of exhaustion. There was no civil war, no assassination, just a slow recentering of the entire apparatus of power, in which her brother faded not through violence but through irrelevance. The foreign emissaries, ever sensitive to the tides of influence, followed suit. When delegations arrived from Rome, their gifts were offered with her in mind. When they spoke of the future of trade, the tone suggested that only Cleopatra's decisions mattered. She listened carefully, speaking sparingly yet decisively, offering neither deference nor challenge, only clarity. Her brother, when present, stood a step behind or sat at the edge of meetings where he once presided. No one asked his opinion, and in time, neither did he offer one. The transformation of the court extended beyond names and faces it affected, how time itself was marked. Calendars once indexed jointly now listed events under her regnal years alone. The palace murals slowly evolved, commissioned by artists who subtly removed his presence from frescoes of shared triumphs, painting scenes that favored a lone queen surrounded by an ambiguous retinue. The records did not falsify, they simply became selective, and over time, those selections hardened into truth. There remained a handful who remained loyal to the memory of Ptolemy's early promise, a few elderly guards, a wet nurse long retired, an old astrologer who once charted his ascension in the stars, and still muttered predictions in corridors no one visited. But loyalty rooted in memory cannot resist the pressure of the present, and even they found themselves hesitating before mentioning him in Cleopatra's presence, not because she discouraged it, but because they no longer knew where he fit. Among the public, the change was more immediate. Markets spoke of the queen with familiarity and awe. Her image was everywhere on coins, in hymns, etched into amphorae that traveled the river. Children recited parables in which she appeared as the wise woman who outwitted rivals and tamed gods. Ptolemy's name, once common in the chants of schoolboys, faded to a historical marker useful in reciting lineage but detached from emotion. He became a placeholder in royal genealogies, no more vivid than the stone statues that bore his ancestors' faces with fading eyes. At court, his own rooms remained unlocked but undisturbed. Servants dusted them weekly, changed linens monthly, and aired the windows according to protocol. But the man himself had long since retreated to a distant villa along the Canopic branch of the Nile, where he hosted modest gatherings of minor nobles and old tutors. There, he played host to stories of a past that no longer rippled outward. There were evenings of poetry and wine, tales of his father's reign, musings on philosophy, but no messengers came bearing requests for his counsel. No boats arrived with foreign seals seeking alliance. And though Cleopatra never sent him away, she never summoned him either. She had no need to. Her court ran with precision decisions made before they were even fully spoken. Correspondence answered before wax had cooled. Advisors were chosen not by lineage, but by insight. Councils convened not out of ritual, but out of necessity. She surrounded herself not with flatterers, but with interpreters, engineers, scholars, and spies, those who served Egypt's continuity rather than its nostalgia. One evening, during the festival of Opet, a low-ranking official mistakenly read Ptolemy's name aloud during a ceremonial blessing. The crowd did not gasp. The queen did not stir. But afterward, the young man was quietly transferred to a minor post in a southern district. He was not punished. He was simply displaced, moved out of rhythm with a court that had trained itself to flow in a single, continuous voice. Even among the palace musicians, something shifted. Songs once sung in dual harmony adjusted themselves to solo performance. The chorus of unity became a ballad of solitary grace. And when dancers performed for visiting dignitaries, their formations honored the queen alone, tracing her story in movement without needing to reference anyone else's. One could argue it was a kind of forgetting, but that would be too simple. It was more like a collective refocusing, as if the entire machinery of power had chosen, consciously or not, to tune itself to a single note. The court did not erase Ptolemy from history. It simply allowed him to drift toward the perimeter of memory, unanchored, unspoken, yet still present in the stonework, in the architecture, in the shadowed corners of mosaics, where a second figure might once have stood. Cleopatra, aware of this silence, did not break it. There is a kind of mercy in letting some names fade without protest. It spares the need for conflict, and it leaves no blood on the floor. Just the sound of footsteps moving forward, uninterrupted. And behind them, a name that no one needed to say aloud to remember what it had become. There was no public break between Cleopatra and Ptolemy, no formal abdication, no council vote, no declaration read aloud in the square. What occurred instead was quieter than betrayal, more methodical than rebellion. A process so gentle, so ceremonial, it seemed on the surface not to be a conflict at all. It was a rearrangement of shadows in the palace, of duties quietly reassigned, of entrances and exits revised without explanation. Ptolemy was not overthrown. He was excused. What remained of his authority was not seized, but released, as if even he understood there was no longer space for his version of rulership within the architecture of the court. He had once ruled beside her, then behind her, and then, for a time, adjacent. But eventually, adjacency became absence. She never pushed him away, not directly. That would have required naming what was happening. Instead, she simply stepped into every silence he left behind, until there were none left for him to occupy. The final moment was not a trial, nor a spectacle. It was a curtain drawn in the council hall, not symbolic, but literal. One morning, as court assembled in the upper colonnade chamber to receive word from the southern garrisons. The royal dais had been adjusted. Only one seat remained in the center, carved in ebony and inlaid with lapis. The other, his, had been removed. No one addressed the change aloud. No guards explained it. There were no murmurs of protest. The court simply sat, listened, nodded when the queen spoke, and when the business was concluded, they bowed to her and her alone. From that moment on, Ptolemy was no longer expected. He was still alive, still in the city, still breathing the same scented air from gardens watered by the Nile. But he was not summoned. His voice did not echo in the vaulted halls. His seal, when used, received no response. The messengers he dispatched to court returned with vague answers, not of refusal, but of delay, and then, eventually, nothing. Cleopatra, when asked, gave no edicts. She gave no denials. She allowed the silence to stand in for her will, and in that silence, 1,000 unspoken orders took root. The city understood. It always did. Alexandria did not need proclamations to grasp power. It had lived too long beneath palatial ceilings not to recognize when the breeze had shifted. In the marketplaces, coinage bearing Cleopatra's sole image became the only ones exchanged without scrutiny. Priests offered their prayers with her name alone. Foreign traders who once fumbled over who to address in their scrolls now wrote plainly, boldly, "To Her Majesty Cleopatra, Philopator." Even the children, in their street games, began pretending only one monarch ruled. They sang songs about the clever queen who could trick the Romans and tame the gods. Ptolemy, when he appeared in those rhymes at all, was reduced to a line or two, usually the confused brother who got lost on his way to the council chamber or who fell asleep during war. It was not a character assassination. It was a character fading. And yet, none of this was quite what he had feared in the beginning. There was no mob at his door, no sword pressed to his throat. He remained clothed in his dignity, if not in his relevance. The villa he retired to, just beyond the edge of the royal district, was comfortable, not ostentatious, but serene pillars wrapped in flowering vines, fountains that trickled into shallow pools, gardens where he could walk without being recognized, or at least without being acknowledged. He kept a few retainers, men who had once stood at the edge of strategy meetings and now poured wine with careful hands, women who once translated letters from Rome and now tended the fig trees. In the evenings, he read aloud from old scrolls, Homer, Herodotus, occasionally Plato. His voice had once been trained for public address. Now it was softer, slower, unsure of itself. He wrote occasionally, sometimes long reflections on the nature of dual rulership, sometimes letters to Cleopatra that were never sent. He did not hate her. He had tried, for a time. But hatred, too, requires a sense of being wronged, and what she had done, what she had allowed to happen, had never been direct. He could not point to a moment where she had betrayed him, only to a series of gestures, choices, silences that, when viewed together, formed a mural in which he no longer belonged. She had not pushed him out. She had merely walked ahead. Sometimes, he wondered if this was what she had always intended. From the beginning, she had been the quicker of the two, more fluent in languages, more precise in memory, more attuned to the mood of a room, the cadence of a threat, the timbre of an opportunity. Perhaps the real surprise was not that she had claimed the throne alone, but that it had taken this long for everyone to admit she had always been the one ruling. Still, the part of him that remembered their shared childhood, the long afternoons, learning ritual postures in the temple garden, the games of hide and seek in the servant corridors, the whispered conversations when their father was in a rage, still ached, not for power, but for companionship, for the sense that they had once faced the world together, two children cradled in an empire too large for either to fully grasp. That memory did not hurt in the way betrayal does. It hurt in the way a scar itches before a storm. He did not ask to return. He did not try to reclaim his place. He walked his gardens and watched the vines bend under the weight of ripening grapes. He stared at the clouds drifting toward the sea. He studied the stars, though no one asked him anymore for his interpretations. And sometimes, when he passed by the reflection pools and caught the shape of his face beside the moon's shimmer, he would mutter a line from Sappho or Euripides and laugh to himself, quietly, as if he were the last one in the audience of a play he once believed he had written. Meanwhile, Cleopatra ruled. She ruled not with volume, but with gravity. Her presence drew others into orbit: advisors, generals, emissaries, poets. Her decisions shaped the pulse of the Mediterranean. Her gestures recalibrated alliances. Her silences could end negotiations or begin wars. She did not celebrate her brother's retreat, but she did not mourn it either. She moved forward as if nothing had changed, because, in truth, it had changed long before the curtain had ever been pulled. And so, the court moved on. The palace thrived, and behind it all, beyond the colonnades and the temple courtyards, in a house tucked between marble and dust, Ptolemy remained unharmed, unhonored, unneeded. No sword had drawn blood. Only a curtain had drawn time. And in that quiet rearrangement of space, a brother stepped aside without a word, and a queen remained, not because she fought for the throne, but because she was the only one who had truly stayed in the room. History prefers winners. It drapes them in clean sentences, marches them across papyrus scrolls and marble tablets, and lets poets kiss their names into rhythm. And yet, despite its favor for the victorious, there are shadows even Rome could not erase. One of them walked the corridors of Alexandria barefoot. One of them breathed in the language of 13 gods and replied with none. One of them smiled while the empire looked away, then ruled when no one thought she still could. Cleopatra's final years were not marked by triumph. They were not gilded with the kind of glory Rome respected. No parades, no expansions, no treaties signed on enemy chariots. But they were years nonetheless carved out like canals in stone, flowing with decisions, alliances, betrayals that outlasted ink and outlived statues. While Augustus sharpened his image into the face of a new empire, Cleopatra receded into something harder to pin down. Not a widow, not a ruler's consort, not even, by Rome's measure, a queen anymore. She became something else entirely, a silence too deep to interpret, a presence too complex to narrate. After the fall of Mark Antony, after the palace stood quiet and the children were ushered behind drawn curtains, she did not immediately choose death. That is Rome's version, a clean ending, a poetic sigh of a snake, a willing, noble suicide. But those close to her remembered it differently. There were days of hesitation, walks along the shadowed porticos where she whispered to no one, anxious letters sent, not to allies, but to enemies. A visit from a Roman official who left the chamber pale, offering no report to his superiors. Some said she still believed there was a bargain to be made, not for her life, perhaps, but for Egypt's dignity. She had lived too long negotiating the impossible to abandon the attempt in the final hour. Yet Rome does not record negotiation as resistance. It prefers to call it surrender. So they told the version that suited them, that she chose the asp, noble and theatrical, lying still in her linen robes while the world quietly moved on. But those robes were not white, and her final chamber was not a stage. She died in a room that smelled of myrrh and dried oranges, beneath painted ceilings her ancestors had commissioned, beside the carved image of Isis breastfeeding a god. Her hands were not folded, they were clenched. The body Rome displayed in words was not the woman they feared. They called her mad, manipulative, wanton, foreign. The older senators, trembling with borrowed power, spoke of her as if she had invaded their dreams, as if her presence in history was an infection they could not purge. And so they wrote her out, line by line, a little less queen, a little more caricature, a foreign seductress, a barbarian queen, a historical footnote wrapped in silk and poison. But Egypt remembered her differently. Not with statues, most were shattered. Not with scrolls, most were burned. But with traces. Names passed down the Nile that no scribe could quite explain. Songs sung by temple girls at festivals where her likeness was no longer allowed. But her spirit lingered. The scent of blue lotus oil burned in rituals for goddesses who had once worn her face. In the walls of certain village homes, a woman painted standing upright, one hand raised, not a goddess, but not quite mortal either. Children named for her, not in palaces, but in alleyways. Her sons, separated and scattered by Augustus, did not return to reclaim Egypt. Caesarion was captured and killed, too many Caesars. Augustus had said, the others, raised in Rome under watchful eyes, were folded into the very narrative that erased their mother, but none of them forgot her. And that, in the end, was the greater danger. Because memory cannot be conquered like territory. You cannot occupy a myth. You cannot rewrite a shadow. Even as Rome painted frescoes of its new triumphs, even as poets wrote of Pax Romana, and historians traced the lineage of emperors to gods, Cleopatra remained haunting the gaps. Her absence became too perfect to ignore. The silence left behind her, that strange hush in the wind around Alexandria's ruins, echoed louder than any official record, even when scholars could no longer agree on what she had looked like. They agreed on one thing: no woman had ever ruled quite like her. It was not power that defined her legacy. It was the refusal to let power define her. She had ruled with her voice, her language, her intelligence. She had played empires like lyres, tuned them, tested them, performed to them, and, when needed, walked away. She had used beauty not as a weapon, but as a distraction, a curtain to shield the true blade, her comprehension of the moment, her manipulation of the stage, her ability to see 6 moves ahead in a game the world thought only men could play. And when they realized she had outplayed them, it was too late. That is what Rome hated most. Not her alliances, not her lovers, not even her crown, but that she had remained sovereign in a world that tried, every step of the way, to make her a spectacle. When future historians returned to the ruins of Alexandria, what they found were pieces, fragments of pillars, broken amphorae, bits of mosaic glass still shimmering in the sun. No grand tomb, no sarcophagus with inscriptions, no sign saying, "Here lies the last queen of Egypt." She had not allowed herself to be buried in a way they could claim. Her story refused the neatness of endings, and in doing so, it outlived every empire that tried to box it in. She became an echo, a curve in the river where birds flew differently, a part of the Nile's breath that knew her name and still whispers it, soft, under the water reeds. Her face faded from coinage, but not from dreams. Her name lost its place in textbooks, but not in the corners of lullabies sung in temples too ruined to name. Even in Rome, long after her death, women looked to the east and wondered. They wore kohl too dark, spoke in foreign rhythms, dressed in dyed silks that carried the scent of stories no senator could fully understand. The city never said her name out loud again, but it flinched every time someone did. Because you can erase a statue, you can melt down a crown, you can rewrite a scroll and bury a tomb, but you cannot rewrite the shadow of a queen who never looked away. And Cleopatra, even in her end, never looked away. She saw them coming. And then she disappeared, not in surrender, but in strategy. She left them only her silhouette to chase. And they are still chasing it.